First of all, I want to thank the Rafael del Pino Foundation for its contribution to the spread of knowledge and new ideas, and also for the opportunity to talk to Matt Ridley, a person with a deep knowledge about innovation. I am not going to debate with him, but to talk about the ideas of his book, How Innovation Works, that as far as we have seen, his title has been translated into Spanish as Claves de la innovación. I have read the book, and I can assure you it is a very, very interesting reading, not only for people interested in innovation, but for everybody that is curious and for everybody that wants to understand the modern world. It is not exactly a theoretical work about innovation, as scientists or engineers might have written it. In fact, it is a combination of history and an understanding of the nature of innovation and how it works. Matt Ridley shows us how innovations are developed through process of essays and fails, and while doing it, the author shows us that innovators are real human beings that may fail or may be successful, depending on many circumstances, including serendipity. Serendipity is a word that appears many times along the book and plays a very important role in getting success as an innovator. I would like to thank Anthony Bosch for publishing the Spanish version of the book. I also would like to thank him because he's publishing truly fundamental works that allow us understanding modern world. For instance, Richard Baldwin's The Great Convergence or the Globotic Archival, that thanks to Anthony Bosch, we can enjoy the Spanish versions because he has published them. We may say that innovation is a trending topic nowadays. In our globalized world, the competitiveness of companies is critical for its survival. Our living standards depend on innovation, competitiveness depends on innovations, and thanks of innovation, we can solve the major problems affecting humanity. For instance, famines. Matt Ridley devotes a full chapter of the book to food and innovations regarding food, to pandemics or climate change. So, innovation is something that we can easily identify, but what is exactly innovation? Is it science? Is it technology? What are we talking about when we refer to innovation? Lord Ridley, please, can you explain us what innovation is?
Well, innovation is the adoption of new habits and new technologies by people. And it's a ubiquitous, important, widespread phenomenon. Everybody has experienced innovation in their lives, and that has been happening for hundreds of years. But I argue that we don't fully understand how it happens, why it happens when and where it does, why it happens very rapidly in some technologies and more slowly in others, and then that changes in the future. I also argue that innovation is not the same thing as invention. Inventing a new device is all very well, but you have to make that device available, affordable, and reliable. And that is a process that often takes a lot longer, a lot more money, a lot more ingenuity than we tend to give it credit for. So I see innovation very much as a sort of process that happens within human society, a very collective process. A lot of people get involved in it. It doesn't work if you try and do it all on your own. It works through the sharing of ideas, the exchange of ideas, and the feedback from consumers as to what it is they want from innovation. So it's an enormously important phenomenon, absolutely fundamental to the world. Without it, we wouldn't have prosperity and we wouldn't have economic growth. But we don't really have a good theory of how to make it happen or why it happens. And that's why I decided to write the book, to try and start to put together a theory of where innovation comes from.
Okay, Lord Ridley, thank you for your introduction. So let me start by a very important question regarding your works, that is, in fact, how innovation works.
So how does innovation work? For me, it's all about the interaction between ordinary people and technology or ordinary people and culture and habits in the world. And from this interaction comes a tendency to experiment, for some people somewhere to try something new. And this is absolutely fundamental to the process of innovation. It doesn't work if people only try one thing. Again and again, if you talk to innovators, trial and error, experimentation turns out to be a very important part of the process. So to give a good example of this, I tell the story of the invention of the aeroplane in my book. And there are two different teams of people trying to produce powered flight at the same time in the same month, December 1903, in the same country, in the United States. One is a man named Samuel Langley, who was a very intelligent, very well-connected, very politically astute person. He was an astronomer. He was head of the Smithsonian Institution. And he thought he could design an aeroplane. And he went off and did it in secret, got a huge grant from the US government, launched his aeroplane off the top of a boat on the Potomac River, and it crashed into the water after 20 meters. Just 10 days later, on an island off North Carolina, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, Orville and Wilbur Wright, succeeded where Langley had failed. They got an airplane sustainably into the air, not for very long, but for a short flight. And then over the next few years, they improved it dramatically. What they had done right, which Langley had done wrong, in my view, was that they had done a huge number of experiments. They had been working with gliders and kites and aerofoils in wind tunnels for years and years and years, before they even first put an engine on one of these devices, so that they gradually solved a whole series of problems, like how you steer in the air, what the right ratio between the height and the width of a wing is in an aerofoil shape. And they had drawn upon lots of other people's ideas. So they had been picking the brains of people all over the world, particularly a very clever person in Australia who'd done a lot of experiments with box kites, but also a lot of people in France and Germany and other places. So it's very much drawing upon the collective wisdom of the world and trying things, experimenting again and again and again, that is the fundamental method by which innovation happens. It's not one clever person going off into a small room and having a bright idea. And I think we actually tell the stories of innovation and invention wrong, because we celebrate one person having a eureka moment, as we say in English. You know, Archimedes shouted eureka when he had found his breakthrough in how to measure the volume of something. And it doesn't happen that way. It's a much more gradual process, a much more collective process, a much more messy process with a lot of trial and error. And I think if we continue to tell stories about genius inventors transforming the world in one moment, we mislead people, and we actually prevent them trying innovation themselves. I'm a great believer that this should be a very democratic process. Everybody should be involved in innovation.
Well, you have talked about a lot of cumulative knowledge that at the end results on the success of the Wright brothers. But my question, reading your book, was usually people studying creativity, innovation, and so on used to tell us the story of Florence and the origins of Renaissance art and so on, because explaining that there are a lot of connections between Michelangelo, Leonardo, and so on, because they live in a city. But somehow Langley and the Wright brothers were more or less isolated in the middle of the United States. So how do we need to work in urban areas, in cities, and so on, to have innovation, or it may happen everywhere if we have the proper connections?
Well, it's true that the Italian Renaissance was a time of great innovation. It was probably the most innovative part of the world in the 1400s, when Leonardo and Machiavelli and all these other people were operating. Fibonacci is somebody I celebrate in my book, the person who basically brought Indian numerals to Europe, a very important innovation, not that he made himself, but that he introduced from elsewhere in the world. And the clue there is that these were city-states. These were trading cities. Fibonacci came from Pisa, and his father was a trader. He grew up in North Africa, where he met Arabs who used a different system of counting. And so the crucial thing is trade here. A city-state that is open to world trade will pick up ideas, combine them with other ideas from different places, and produce innovations, because most of the technologies and ideas that we have are actually different combinations of existing technologies. But there is one exception to this that I think is quite important, which is that empires are not very good at innovation. The Roman Empire didn't produce a lot of innovation. There's some civil engineering innovations, some things like glass and so on, but actually it's a time of relatively slow innovation over 600 or 700 years. The same is true of the Ottoman Empire. The same is true of the Ming Empire in China, a very big, dynamic and powerful empire that effectively crushed innovation, sent it backwards. And the reason for this is because although empires are free trade zones, so they ought to be good places for innovation because there's a lot of ideas coming together through free trade, they tend to be very centralized, and they tend to have bureaucracies that try to decide what people can do and what people can't do. And you see this very clearly in the Ming Empire in China, where every merchant was effectively told when he could travel, where he could travel, what goods he must store, and so on. And this is a recipe for killing experiment and innovation. A few hundred years before that, China had a very innovative period, a period when it produced extraordinary innovations like printing and gunpowder and the compass and all these sorts of inventions. And that was the Song dynasty, which was organized on very different lines from the Ming dynasty, in that it wasn't controlled from the center. Each city was free to run itself. It was effectively run by the merchants. And it was like a series of city-states. So for me, the ideal political structure for producing innovation is the city-state, or a conglomeration of city-states, like you see in Renaissance Italy, like you see in the Netherlands a century later, and like you see around the San Francisco Bay in the 20th century. Yes, cities are important because actually much innovation happens in city. And even the Wright brothers lived in a city, albeit a small one, Dayton, Ohio. It wasn't, as it were, the middle of nowhere. In fact, Ohio was actually a very innovative place around the same time. You get the sewing machine and various other things coming from Ohio around the same time. So cities are important, but small individual cities that run themselves, not great big imperial capitals, are where you get innovation happening, in my view.
Cities are important, obviously, but another question that I want to ask you is regarding to this talking is, is the institutional framework important too? Because I remember reading, for instance, the works of Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail, how they explain the importance of institutional framework for the developing of nations and so on. It is also important for the developing of innovation.
Yes, I think it's definitely true that the institutional framework makes a big difference, that you have to set up a society in which people can raise money, people can spend money on what they want, people can exchange ideas through societies and media and this kind of thing. all these institutions matter a great deal. And you see, for example, in Victorian England or in 20th century America, the right kinds of incentives for innovators being put in place. So that if you decide to start your own company and make a new device that nobody has made before and experiment in making it better, you will be able to reward yourself. Now, for a lot of people, that means intellectual property. That means patents. Will I get a great big reward from the patent if I invent something? I actually am very skeptical about patents. I think they don't encourage as much innovation as we think. I think on the whole, they encourage monopolies that get in the way of innovation, and that we have we see more innovation when patents expire than when they're first granted. So it's not so much about the property side of things that for me, it's more about the institutions for the exchange of ideas, for the exchange of capital, for the exchange of investment, and for the exchange of people, for people to be able to move. So open immigration for talent is important, and so on. Now, if you look at California in the 1960s to 2000s, by far the most innovative part of the world, it also has things going on there that are very specific to it. Not only is it mixing lots of people from all around the world and giving them lots of freedom to do what they want, it also has very specific things like being able to sell part of your company but still retain control of it. That seems to be important. So you can write a recipe of a lot of these things. But again and again, we find that countries stumble into the right recipe for innovation rather than design it from scratch. There aren't any good examples of a country sitting down and saying, we want to be the most innovative country. We're going to set up our institutions in such a way that we are innovative. And we will therefore become very prosperous. Some of that happens, but often it's too centralized, too directed, too much about government picking the winner technologies rather than allowing the freedom of experimentation. One of the interesting counterexamples to what I'm talking about, perhaps, is China, which is now a very, very innovative country. Does that come from economic freedom? Well, it's not a free country politically, but in a funny way, China is quite a free country, or has been quite a free country economically. That is to say, if you set up a business for the first time in China, you face very few bureaucratic obstacles of the kind that you face in Western countries, as long as you are not setting up a new political party. So it feels to me that China is not an exception to my rule, that the institution that matters most is freedom.
So the structure of incentives plays a central role in innovation, but there are other kind of institutions, for instance, educational institutions, because you have talked about California, and in the middle of Silicon Valley lies Stanford University, or in England, in the middle of the innovation networks lies universities like Oxford, Cambridge, Birmingham, and so on. So do we need also educational institutions, proper educational institutions related with research and development, or not?
Yes, we do. Educational institutions are very important, and the role of MIT or Stanford in America cannot be underestimated. But if you take Britain as an example of an innovative country in particularly the 1800s, Oxford and Cambridge plays a relatively small part in that. And so do other universities. You get some significance from the Scottish universities, Edinburgh and Glasgow, in the 18th century. But the great industrial revolution, the explosion of innovation in Birmingham and in Manchester, has very little to do with educational institutions. So I think it's important to have good educational institutions to educate people and to do research. But I think we tend to exaggerate the degree to which the original drive for innovation does come from universities. Because we generally have in our heads a model which says that universities discover science, that science is then applied through invention, and that then leads to economic growth. This is called the linear model, that you start with science, you then apply it in technology, and then you produce business. Sometimes that happens, but surprisingly often, it doesn't work that way. You invent technologies, and then you have to explain the science behind them. So, for example, vaccination was invented 300 years ago. We didn't have the foggiest idea how it works for hundreds of years. We still don't, I would argue. We have some idea about the immune system, but we don't fully understand why a vaccine works and why another one does not. Or to take another example, the steam engine was invented before the science of thermodynamics. So for me, it's very much a two-way relationship between technology and business on the one hand and science and universities on the other. Sometimes it goes that way, sometimes it goes the other way. And it's very useful to have these educational institutions, but not to expect them to be the source of all innovation. I think that's putting too much pressure on them to apply their work. Quite a lot of the time, they should be the fruit of science, the fruit of innovation, not the seed of innovation.
Every time we think on innovators, we keep in mind the image of a scientist or an engineer. But my question after reading your book, because I want you to talk about this, is can common people, plain people, be innovators too?
Very much so. One of the things I wanted to do in this book was to demystify the innovator, to get away from the idea that only very, very clever people can be innovators. Because I think sometimes the way we talk about it, particularly in schools to children, we imply that unless you've got this special blood flowing in your veins called creativity, you can't join the party. And I don't think that's the case. Let me go back to the Wright brothers again. Neither of those two men had a university degree. Their sister did have a university degree, interestingly, but they didn't. Whereas their rival, Samuel Langley, had a PhD. There are lots of other examples of really quite ordinary people who made extraordinary contributions. Just today, I was listening on the radio to an account of John Harrison, the person who solved the problem of measuring longitude at sea, for which there was a great big prize in England in the 18th century. And he's a humble clockmaker from Yorkshire. And all the grand astronomers, they say, well, we can't give this prize to a clockmaker. You know, he's not someone we invite to dinner. but he did. He solved the problem. I also write in my book about a relatively new phenomenon, which I think is very interesting, which is, it goes by the name of free innovation, which is where ordinary consumers themselves develop innovations that feed back into the technology. So the example I give is of parents of diabetic children who want to be able to monitor the sugar levels in their children's blood remotely while the children are at school. And some of them got together, these parents, and developed computer programs that would allow them to do this, which they then kind of sold back to the companies that were developing the devices for measuring sugar in blood. Sorry, insulin in blood. Well, yes, it's both sugar and insulin that needs to be measured. This is an example of sort of user-generated in innovation. And arguably, I would say that the internet is a good example of this. That the question who invented the internet is meaningless. You can say that Vint Cerf played a very important role. You can say that Tim Berners-Lee played an important role. You can say that the people who invented packet switching were crucial to it. You can say that the invention of the computer led to the internet. But these are really only very small contributions compared with the work of millions of different people making little innovations in the way they use the internet that then get picked up by other people. That there is a huge amount of free innovation going on in the internet. It's a bit like the way we invent language. I'm sure the Spanish language is the same as the English language. New words come into it. Old words get forgotten. Words change their meanings over time. That's not because there's some clever person sitting around a table with a committee telling us which words we should adopt in this year and which words we should stop using, but because we all do it. It's a collective phenomenon. And so, yes, I'm a tremendous Democrat when it comes to innovation. I think everybody should be involved.
Another image that we have in mind about the innovator is that it is always a man, a male. And sometimes we forgot, for instance, that now that we have talked about internet and the IT, that the origin of the IT, the basis was invented by a woman, Ada Lovelace, but nobody remembers, or few people remember Ada Lovelace, while many people remember Alan Turing. And after reading your book, I want you to talk also about the role of women in innovation. For instance, previously you have referred to the vaccines, and I remember reading a lot of things of the important role of women in vaccines. So I would like you to talk about women in innovation and why we don't have so many innovators women, at least in the past.
Well, it's a very important point. Vaccines are a superb example of this. The person who brought vaccination to Europe from Constantinople was a woman. She was an English woman called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was the wife of the ambassador. She got to know women in the harem of the Sultan, and she found that they were using this practice of preventing smallpox by giving small doses from a survivor of smallpox to a child. And she came back to London and she persuaded eventually the Prince of Wales to try it. And this was not vaccination, it was inoculation at the time, or engrafting, as they called it then. But it led eventually to the same idea with a safer version, which is what we call vaccination. So at the very root of vaccination, there are women, because not only Lady Mary, but also the women from whom she picked up the habit in the harem of the Sultan. Then hundreds of years later, in the 1930s, there are two women who I write about in the book who developed a vaccine for whooping cough, for pertussis. And they did this in 4 years flat in their spare time. They were bacteriologists. They were, technicians working in this field, but this was not their main project. And they did it to the surprise of everybody. Nobody believed them. Everybody said, well, you can't have just invented a vaccine that works against this serious disease that's killing lots and lots of people. It was a very serious cause of death at the time in the 1930s. Pearl Kendrick and Grace Eldering were their names. But they had succeeded. And eventually they persuaded the world, with the help of Eleanor Roosevelt as well, that they had made a huge difference. As you mentioned, also, women have played a key role in the computer industry. Grace Hopper and other women really developed most of the important software routines that are now central to computing. Why? Because men saw hardware in computing as the important stuff, and software as just an extension of, the work of clerks and typists. And so they left it to women to do this. And some very extraordinary women did some very extraordinary things in developing the techniques of computer programming. The subroutines and things like that were invented by women. So there is no doubt that women can play just as important a part as men in innovation. To some extent, they do it a little bit differently. And by that, I mean, they don't make such a big fuss about getting the credit and the reward. So Grace and Pearl, the two women who invented the whooping cough vaccine, never tried to make money out of it, never tried to claim a patent on it, never got rich, never got famous. That was partly because World War II broke out while they were doing it, so it wasn't a big news. So you don't tend to find women getting involved in these furious legal disputes that often happen in the case of men. So the man who invented the telegraph, Samuel Morse, the man who invented radio, Marconi, the two people who invented the airplane, the Wright brothers, they spent years of their life in court, furiously trying to defend their priority as the inventors of things against rivals. My impression is that women aren't quite so apt to waste their time in that way.
In your book, you present a lot of people that have contributed to many innovations in many fields. And after studying such a big number of innovators, is it possible to define the main characteristics of an innovator, characteristics, aspects they have in common?
Well, yes and no. I think there are some features that one can describe, but I did surprise myself when I was writing this book by finding exceptions to rules. So to give an example of that, one of the people I profile in the book is Gordon Moore, the inventor of Moore's law, and a person who played an absolutely central role in the integrated circuit, the computer chip, the whole story of Intel and all this kind of thing. A fundamental innovator at the heart of Silicon Valley for many years, still alive in his 90s. Now, Gordon Moore, the canonical Silicon Valley person is, somebody from an immigrant background who's very unreasonable, very impatient, very demanding, very aggressive, very energetic. I'm talking about Steve Jobs or someone like that. Gordon Moore is the opposite of all those things. He was born in California, a few miles from where he lives today. He is preternaturally patient and friendly and kind and non-aggressive. He's not unreasonable at all. He's very quiet, So the opposite of Steve Jobs in some ways. But 5 miles apart, these two people had huge impact on innovation. So I don't think there is a personality that you can say is good at innovation. But I do think that clearly there are features that have to be there. You have to be open-minded. Again and again, inventors try and invent one thing, and then they have to notice that that's not working, but something else is working, and they have to change direction and go in a different direction. So, for example, Art Fry, the person who invented the Post-it note, the little yellow sticky paper that we all use, he was trying to invent a permanent glue for paper. He developed this glue that didn't work. It kept coming off again. And then he realized that this could be useful in his hymn book when he was in church, in choir practice. So he sort of spotted that he needed to change direction. So this serendipity, this need to be ready to change your mind is very important. And not everybody has that. Some people just remain focused on the one thing they're trying to achieve, and they won't move direction. So open-mindedness, willingness to share. Again, the Samuel Langley story about trying to do things in secret doesn't work. You have to pick other people's brains. You have to put together your head with someone else's head. So these are the characteristics that you need to have as an innovator. But of course, one of the things I'm arguing in the book is that the person doesn't matter as much as we think. There are 21 different people who invented light bulbs in the same period. Lodygin in Russia, Swan in England, Edison in America, and ones in Belgium, France, Germany, Spain, everywhere. And that implies that if none of them had survived, somebody else would have still invented the light bulb. The same is true of the search engine today. If Google had never been founded, we'd still have search engines. So there's an inevitability about certain innovations happening when they do, which implies that that the personality can be a distraction.
Well, another thing I would like to ask you is regarding the innovation, because when we talk about this word innovation, people used to have in mind a new device that solves problems or a new app that solves problems. But one of the most surprising things I have found in your book is that you consider the introduction of potatoes in Europe as an innovation. Can you explain this, please?
Yes, I wanted to give some examples in the book that weren't machines, that weren't devices, but were nonetheless new practices, new habits, new things. And as far as Europe is concerned, the potato is an incredibly important innovation. It not only provides an enormous amount of food for a given area of land, it also can be easily stored. It turned out to be a very good way of feeding armies, so it keeps war going, and so on. And so I wanted to ask the question, how did potatoes get introduced to Europe? How difficult was it? How easy was it? Very difficult was the answer. A lot of resistance. In England, many clergymen, many priests were arguing, we can't have potatoes because they come from a papist country. They come from Spain, which is Catholic, and that's not acceptable. So extraordinary reasons. The French were very slow to take up the potato, and it was only because the Germans kept beating them in warfare. The Prussians eating potatoes were their armies were better fed, that eventually they decided on a sort of centralized campaign to try and persuade people to grow potatoes and eat them. And Marie Antoinette got involved, and she wore potato flowers in her hat to try and celebrate this and to cause people. But of course, the potato comes from South America. It was brought back by the conquistadors from Peru, and it's used to growing at very high altitudes in the Andes, and in the tropics, where the day length is the same all the year round. So it wasn't automatic that it could grow in Europe. It would grow at the wrong time of year, et cetera, et cetera. There seems to have been a period when it was grown in the Canary Islands, the Canarias, for some years in order to change its genetics until it was capable of growing in European conditions. And then there are some very early examples of people taking potatoes from the Canarias to the Low Countries, to Spanish Netherlands. While I'm talking about potatoes, I'd also like to mention coffee, which is another innovation that I talk about in the book. Coffee is an innovation around the same time as the potatoes, the 1500s. That comes from Africa rather than South America. Again, huge resistance to coffee. Wherever coffee came in, it was banned. Kings and rulers were constantly making coffee illegal. Two reasons for that. One was because the wine and beer industry didn't like this new competitor, and they campaigned against it, and they often made extraordinary medical reasons for a ban, saying, we have done research and we have found that coffee is bad for you, that it dries out your kidneys and it poisons your liver. This is a very early example of the precautionary principle in action. But the other reason for banning coffee was because it tended to be sold in coffee houses where the it could be ground up and the coffee made instantaneously when it was fresh. And people would go to coffee houses, and when they were there, they would have conversations. And the conversations would sometimes be a little animated because of the coffee, and would result in criticism of the king. People might have a gossip about whether the king was doing a good job or a bad job. So that was why the king kept banning coffee. Particularly in England, you find a very specific example in the 1670s. King Charles II bans all coffee houses because people are spreading fake news in them. That's his way of putting it.
In your book, you give the reader a lot of examples of the benefits of innovation. But why so many people are against innovation?
It's a really good question. And we think we're in favor of innovation. We remember the adoption of the mobile phone and things like that and say, we were keen to have new ones. But actually, there's a lot of technologies that we are very suspicious of, that we see campaigns against. Coffee, I've mentioned already. The genetic modification of crops, genetic engineering of plants is an entire technology that has been immensely successful in Latin America and North America, but has been almost completely rejected in Europe based on some very precautionary concerns about what it might do to ecology or to human health. Now, these concerns are very far-fetched, and they have mostly proved to be completely wrong anyway, but still it's very difficult to get past the opposition. And I think there are three reasons why people reject technologies in this way or are very suspicious about them. One is because there are campaigns against it by vested interests, by existing technologies. I've already mentioned how the wine and beer industry campaigned against coffee. You find the same kind of thing going on a lot of the time, that the pharmaceutical industry campaigns against electronic cigarettes, for example, because it has an important market in gums and patches for nicotine. So that's one reason. The second is that precautionary bureaucracies exist, that government agencies say, well, we don't know enough about this, so we're going to regulate it in such a way as to not allow innovation in this product because we're worried about what might happen. And that becomes very important indeed. And the third reason is I think, just psychological, that human beings do have a suspicion of something new. Now, where the new thing is clearly useful to them, like the mobile telephone, then they say, I don't care, I'm going to use it anyway, because it's so useful that I'm not going to worry that it's going to fry my brain with radio waves or whatever their concerns were. So on the whole, innovation does overcome the psychological barriers when it's of direct use to the consumer. But when it seems to be just benefiting the producer, as in the case of genetically modified crops and farmers, then consumers are much less ready to adopt it. But it's not true that we are enthusiastic adopters of all innovations. We are quite often very reluctant.
I think that many people know about innovation is that thanks to innovation, productivity increase. And because of this, we improve our living standard. But there are other economic benefits and social benefits from innovation.
Yes. I mean, I think the main one is that, as you say, we improve our living standards through innovation, and that way we can afford to benefit each other and so on. I mean, one of the big worries about innovation is that it will cause lack of employment, that it will destroy jobs. And that has been a worry for 200 years, ever since the first threshing machines on farms. People have said, these machines will mean mass unemployment. And in the 1960s, there was a lot of concern that computers in factories would lead to mass unemployment, that nobody would have a job in the future. But actually, we found that innovation produced new jobs, jobs like software engineer and flight attendant, which you couldn't have before you had computers or aeroplanes. And in fact, we can have full employment with plenty of technology. Indeed, I think any concern that artificial intelligence is going to destroy jobs is wrong. I think it's going to augment human actors rather than replace them. To some extent, there will be replacement. Some jobs will disappear and others will come in. But one of the things that fascinates me is how innovation does deliver more leisure without destroying jobs. What I mean by that is that if you look at an average person 100 years ago, when they died at 60 and they left school at 15 and they worked 60 hours per week, they would spend roughly 25% of their life at work. The rest would be sleeping or in their childhood or whatever. Today, if you live to 80 and you work for 40 years, between education till 25 and then retirement at 65, and you work a 39-hour week, you will only spend about 10% of your life at work, which is extraordinary when you think about it. It feels like a lot more. And of course, some of the rest is asleep. But so that what that's telling you is that in this mechanized world, you can produce things that other people need for 10% of your time, and other people can produce things that you need for 90% of your time. That's a really good deal. And that's the deal that we have delivered ourselves through technology. A very important insight, I think, into how the world works is to realize that we have moved steadily away from self-sufficiency as an individual over hundreds of thousands of years. So instead of producing the things that you consume, you produce a narrower and narrower thing, very specialized thing. It's called your job. And in exchange for that, you consume an enormously wide diversity of things. You consume the not only the food other people produce, but the machines that they make for you, the films that they make that you watch. All of this is available to you in exchange for one very narrow little thing. So when people say, oh, life has got more monotonous because jobs have got more boring, I think they're forgetting about the fact that most of life is consuming what others produce for you. And that's got much more interesting for us. So that's one of the great benefits of innovation.
And a last question. I would like to ask you about a country like Spain that is an advanced economy, that is formally a democracy, that is a member state of the European Union, but the levels of innovation in Spain are not as high as it should be according to our living standard, our GDP, income per capita, and so on. So what a country like Spain can do to foster innovation?
I think Europe has a problem with innovation generally. It hasn't been able to spawn any of the digital giants like Amazon and Apple and Alibaba in China the same way that other continents have. It hasn't been able to adopt new technologies like energy technologies or biotechnology or any of these things at the same rate as other parts of the world. It is lagging behind on innovation generally. Why is this? Well, in my view, it's because it's trying to run itself as an empire. And the guiding philosophy of the European Union is harmonization. That is to say, every rule must be the same everywhere. And I don't think that works as well as saying, if it's safe in Spain, then it's safe in England, even if you use different ways of deciding. This is mutual recognition. We're not allowing the diversification and experimentation to happen that does happen in America because of the federal state system to some degree, and that has been happening in Asia because of lots of different countries doing different things. So in my view, we have to move away from a philosophy that everything must be the same everywhere in the continent of Europe. We must allow more experimentation. Now, how does Spain do that on its own? The answer, it's not going to be that easy within the European Union to do it on a big scale, but on a small scale, you can set up different rules in different parts of the country. Give Barcelona a slightly different tax regime than Madrid. Give different trade arrangements, free ports in different parts of the country that have different tariffs and so on. Reinforce specialization in certain technologies in certain regions and allow them to flourish. So I'm a great believer in trying sort of differentiated experiments, even in a relatively modest-sized country like Spain. I don't know if that would get me elected. Probably not, but that's not my problem.
Okay, thank you very much, Lord Ridley. I must admit that we have enjoyed very much your words, and I strongly recommend it everybody to read your book, that it is very interesting. There are many, many more things inside your book that apart from the ones you have talked about. And once again, thank you very much for being with us, Lord Ridley.